You said something perfectly ordinary. And then, almost before the sentence was finished, a second process started running underneath it, reviewing what you just said, scanning the other person's expression for signs of how it landed, quietly assembling a case for whether you should have said it differently. Not because anything went wrong, just because you said something, and saying things out loud to other people activates something in you that doesn't fully switch off until you're alone again. And alone is when the real accounting happens. The replay, the alternative versions of the conversation where you said the better thing, the smarter thing, the thing that would have landed without that slight hesitation in their expression that probably meant nothing but might have meant something. The quiet audit of how you came across, like running on a loop you didn't choose and can't seem to stop choosing. The exhausting part isn't caring what people think. Caring what people think is human. The exhausting part is the proportion, the amount of internal resource that goes toward managing, monitoring, and retrospectively evaluating other people's impressions of you. Resource that is not available for anything else while that process is running. And it runs a lot, more than you would choose if choosing were as simple as deciding. Most content about this tells you to care less, to stop seeking approval, to remember that other people aren't thinking about you as much as you think they are. And all of that is true, and none of it helps. Because the problem was never a lack of correct information. If knowing you shouldn't care this much were sufficient to stop caring this much, you would have stopped already. Here's what's actually driving it, and what actually shifts it. Why the standard advice doesn't work. There's a reason the usual prescriptions for caring too much about what people think. Be yourself. Stop seeking approval. Remember your worth. Produce insight without change. And it's the same reason that knowing something intellectually and having it alter your behavior are two completely different things that require two completely different processes. The degree to which you monitor other people's impressions of you is not a conscious choice. It is not a decision you remake every morning. It is an automatic process, deeply ingrained, running below the level of deliberate thought, calibrated by experiences that in many cases predate your ability to examine or question them. Telling someone to simply care less about what people think is like telling someone to simply stop being startled by loud noises. The startle response is not a decision. It is a learned automatic reaction to a specific category of input, and it changes through a different process than deciding to change it. What that process is, and why it works when deciding doesn't, is the actual subject of this video. But to get there, the cause needs to be precise, because the cause is almost never what people assume it is. If this is already reframing why the usual approaches haven't held, hit the like button. Because locating the problem correctly is the only way to apply the right solution, and most content about this topic is applying solutions to a problem it hasn't accurately diagnosed. What's actually underneath it? The conventional explanation for caring too much about what people think is low self-esteem, insecurity, a deficit of self-confidence that, once filled, will make the monitoring stop. And that explanation is partially right, but it mistakes a symptom for a cause. Because the question underneath it is, where does the insecurity come from? And why does it specifically attach to other people's evaluations of you? The answer for the overwhelming majority of people who experience this pattern is located in attachment, specifically in the early experiences of what happened when other people's evaluations of you were not just emotionally significant, but functionally necessary. When the approval or disapproval of the people around you carried real consequences. When reading the emotional weather of others accurately was not a social preference, but a survival skill. The thing that determined whether the environment was safe, whether connection was available, whether the people you depended on were going to be okay. Children who grow up in environments where love or approval is conditional, where warmth is available when you perform correctly and withdrawn when you don't, develop a particular kind of attunement to external evaluation, not as a choice, as an adaptation. The nervous system learns, through repetition, that other people's impressions of you are information that matters enormously. That monitoring them carefully is how you stay safe. That approval means security, and disapproval means something is at risk. That learning does not automatically update when the circumstances change, when you become an adult. When the people whose approval was once genuinely necessary are no longer the ones you depend on. The nervous system that learned to monitor keeps monitoring, applying the same survival level vigilance to contexts where the stakes are infinitely lower, because it was never taught that the stakes changed. The person who sweats what a colleague thinks of a casual comment is not being irrational. They are running a protection system that was built for a different environment and never received the signal that it was safe to stand down. The villain that kept the system running. Here's something worth naming directly, because it sits underneath this pattern for a lot of people and rarely gets acknowledged. The monitoring system, the constant tracking of other people's impressions, does not only develop in response to obviously conditional environments. It also develops in response to something more subtle and more culturally pervasive, the consistent message that your value is located outside yourself, in your performance, in your productivity, in how well you meet the standards other people set, in whether you are liked, approved of, impressive enough, easy enough to be around. That message is not delivered once. It is delivered continuously across schools and workplaces and social structures that evaluate, rank, compare, and reward based on external performance. You were given grades for how well you met someone else's standard. You were praised for achievement and ignored for ordinary existence. You learned thoroughly and early. That being enough was not a state you occupied automatically. It was something you had to earn, repeatedly, through the favorable impressions of the people doing the evaluating. In that context, monitoring those impressions is not a quirk. It is a logical response to a system that made them genuinely consequential. The exhaustion you feel is not weakness. It is the fatigue of running a monitoring system at a scale the current environment no longer requires, but that no one ever officially told you to scale back. Save this video, because the section coming next is where this shifts from explanation to the specific internal process that actually changes the pattern, not by suppressing it, but by addressing what the monitoring system is still trying to protect, what the monitoring system is still protecting. And here is the mechanism that most content on this topic never reaches. The reason caring too much about what people think is so resistant to conscious override is that the monitoring system is not running pointlessly. It is protecting something. Specifically, it is protecting a self-concept that is still at some level contingent on external validation. If your felt sense of being enough, adequate, worthy, acceptable is even partially dependent on other people confirming it, then their impressions of you are not just socially relevant. They are existentially relevant. They are data points in the ongoing, never quite resolved question of whether you are okay. And a question that important does not get monitored casually. It gets monitored obsessively, automatically, with the full weight of the nervous system behind it. And this is why knowing you are enough, saying it to yourself, believing it intellectually, does not stop the monitoring. Because the monitoring is not running in response to a thought. It is running in response to a felt sense of contingency that lives below the thought level. A background uncertainty about okayness that has been present long enough to feel like a fact rather than a belief. What shifts it assured is not more affirmation. It is the accumulation of evidence, behavioral evidence, generated through action, that you can exist in the unfavorable impression of another person and still be okay. That their evaluation of you did not determine anything important. That the ground stayed solid even when the impression was not what you hoped for. This sounds simple, and it is not simple. It requires doing the thing that the monitoring system most wants to prevent. Being visible without managing the outcome, saying the real thing without softening it for reception, allowing the impression to land however it lands, and staying regulated through the uncertainty of not knowing how that was. Not once, repeatedly. Gradually building the experiential evidence that the nervous system was never given. The evidence that unfavorable evaluation is survivable, that it does not determine your worth, that you exist independently of it. Every time you do that and survive it, the contingency loosens a little. The monitoring system receives information it has never had access to before. And over time, not quickly but durably, the process that runs automatically begins to run at a lower intensity. Not because you decided to care less. No, because the nervous system has accumulated enough counter-evidence to begin recalibrating the threat level of other people's impressions. Here is the insight that tends to reframe everything, and it is the one most worth carrying past this video. The people who appear most unbothered by what others think are not people who have stopped caring about connection or approval. They are people whose sense of okayness has become sufficiently internal that external evaluation, while still noticed, does not determine anything fundamental. The goal is not indifference to others. The goal is a self-concept stable enough that other people's impressions become interesting data rather than verdicts, information rather than judgments, things you can hear without needing to immediately manage. That is a completely achievable state. Or it is not a personality type you either have or don't. It is the downstream result of a specific internal process that anyone can move through, at whatever pace the nervous system can tolerate, in whatever increments feel survivable, towards something that is genuinely more free than where you are now. The people this lands hardest for tend to know exactly who they want to send it to. The friend who overthinks every message before sending it, the person you've watched shrink themselves in rooms where they deserved to take up space, the one who comes home from social situations already running the audit. If that person came to mind, this is worth more to them than most things you could send. What stopping actually looks like. One final thing worth saying directly. Nuck, because the how to stop in the title deserves an honest answer rather than a motivational close. Stopping does not look like no longer noticing what people think. You will always notice. Noticing is social intelligence, and social intelligence is not the enemy. Stopping looks like the gap between the impression landing and the spiral beginning getting longer. And then, longer again. And then, in some situations, not happening at all. Not because you suppressed it, but because the impression landed, you registered it. And the question of whether you were still okay answered itself so quickly and so automatically that the spiral had nothing to build from. That is the destination. And the distance between here and there is shorter than the nervous system, in its current state of vigilance, is willing to believe. There is a video on this channel that goes directly into the attachment patterns underneath chronic approval seeking, where they consolidate, how they shape the specific relationships you find most activating, and what the process of building a more internally grounded self-concept actually requires at the level of practice rather than understanding. That is the next layer of what we covered today. And if today named something you have been living with for long enough that it started to feel like just the way you are, it is not just the way you are. That is worth following through on. If the monitoring has become something that is significantly affecting your daily life, your relationships, your capacity to be present, your ability to say what you actually think, please speak with a mental health professional. What we described today is real, it is well understood, and it responds to the right kind of support in ways that self-awareness alone cannot fully replicate. Drop a comment with the specific context where it hits hardest, the type of room, the type of person, the type of interaction where the monitoring runs loudest. Those responses tell everyone watching something important about how consistent the geography of this pattern is across very different people. And that consistency is itself a small piece of the evidence the nervous system needs. That this is not a personal deficiency. It is a human pattern with a human explanation and a genuinely reachable alternative. Don't forget to subscribe And as always, thanks for watching.